Hey, everybody, this is Ed Friedman. I chair Friends of Merrymeeting Bay. Thank you for coming tonight to hear our program and our presenter. I'm going to go through a few slides that sort of let you know if you don't know what Friends of Merrymeeting Bay does. And then I'm going to introduce our speaker, Jay Robbins. And I will be running his slides tonight, and Jay will be talking to you and saying, next slide, please. I want to thank Jay for being here tonight. I want to thank Martin McDonough, our Zoom coordinator, who's here. And I want to thank Lisa Robbins, Jay's wife, who is helping Jay with some of the tech stuff at their end. We are recording, so if you don't want to be recorded, now's the time to leave. I'd ask anyone if you have the option where you're not muted. I think everyone is except for myself and Jay and Martin right now, to turn your phones off so we don't disturb everyone with phone ringing. And if there are questions along the way, there's a chat thing in your Zoom toolbar, and you can open that and you can type in a question, and we will try and get to those at the end of the presentation. I'd like to also point out our next sort of having a history doubleheader here. And I'll touch on this maybe when I get to education, but tomorrow night at 7 will be sort of a second history presentation, and that's a combination theater, sort of living theater film presentation, working with the PT Theater from Massachusetts and the 3rd and 4th graders from Bowdoin Elementary School. And that'll be a premiere, basically a film and a little discussion probably after. So that should be really interesting. And that's based on a PT Theater's program called Your Town, finding something that's of particular interest to a town that they work with and working with the kids to show that in a combination of theater and film. So with that, I'm going to see if I can move the slide. Do you see the birds?
Yes.
Yes. Good. Okay. Yeah. So we are a unique organization that we sort of take a holistic approach to the environment, research, advocacy, land conservation, and education. Some examples of some of the research stuff we've done over the years. Looking at trying to schedule some archaeology again this summer. We use our research to inform our advocacy, some of which is pretty hard-edged. All this stuff is on our website, or a lot of it is. Looking at land use changes over time, whatnot. We're just talking about eagles before the start of the meeting, still surveying and monitoring eagle nests and chicks. A lot of them got hit by the storm. One of our longest term advocacy issues, combination advocacy issues, is getting the lower Androscoggin River upgraded to Class B, which means it'll have a higher minimum level of dissolved oxygen in it, which is good for everyone who lives there. A lot of education over the years really focused on hands-on, a little bit cut short by COVID. Speaker series is part of that, and we'll have this wonderful program tomorrow evening as well. Protected by now over 1,500 acres of land. Our focus is on wildlife habitat around the bay, wetlands. And if you like the presentation tonight, we are recording it, as we said, and you'll be able to find it within a couple of days or so, probably on our homepage, scrolling down the right side under education. And there's a speaker series video list there. We have recordings going back about 10 years. And then beyond that, there's lists, because this is like our 26th year doing the speaker series. The end of the series right here. What's our schedule for the season? Tomorrow's is not on here, but it's a bonus. And so I'm going to introduce Jay now. So Jay is a place-based historian, and he's principal of Robbins Historical Research in Richmond, Maine. He's been documenting connections through genealogical and property research since 1975. As an educator, avocational historical archaeologist, and certainly teller of tales, Jay has a particular love for the early history of the Tidewater Kennebec region. Whether he's piecing together evidence of early discovery and settlement using maps, personal narrative accounts, or uncovering the environmental consequences of the many industries that have thrived along Gardner's Cobbessaconte stream, where 8 dams once stood, or seeking physical evidence of Merrymeeting Bay's lost Scots-Irish colony of Cork, 1719 to 1722, or reading the original Lincoln County court case files that document power struggles that played out Pownalborough Courthouse, or researching early tidal mills, quarries, and brickyards at Edgecombe. Jay works to peel back the layers of time and to really understand that place. This is great. He's Bowdoin College's first environmental studies major back in 1973, and has done graduate work in American and New England studies at USM. Jay served as the executive director of the Lincoln County Historical Association from 2005 to 2010. He also served as officer and director with the Arnold Expedition Historical Society and the Friends of Swan Island. And at one point, Jay was on the Friends of Merrymeeting Bay board for a while. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing for a minute. Jay can start sharing, and I will work on bringing up the, why don't you tell me when you're ready, Jay, and I'll bring up your first slide.
I will let you know. Welcome, everyone. I also would like to say that I've withdrawn all my efforts outside of my own community and brought them inward this year, because this is Richmond's 200th year of liberation from Bowdenham. We have all kinds of events coming up. We've got a regular Talks of Our Town series going on, third Tuesday nights at the Grange Hall. This next one will be on agriculture and agricultural organizations in Richmond. We also have RB Hall Day on Saturday, June 24th, where all of the community bands in Maine that want to come together, and they play music from 8 in the morning till 8 at night. And at noontime, they play, those that want to, 2 or 3 pre-selected RB Hall tunes. RB Hall was second only to John Philip Sousa in creating marches, and he was born in Bowdenham and raised in Richmond. So Ed and I can share that. We also will have Richmond Days, July 22nd through the 30th. That first weekend, we will have Indigenous peoples, Rev War, French and Indian War encampments on the waterfront. I think we may also have a fireman's muster that day. So stay tuned to Richmond. It's all on the town website. I should also say that much of what I'm going to say today, you can also access directly or indirectly through the Lincoln County Historical Association website. Okay, I'm ready, Ed, for the first slide.
All right. See it full screen now, Jay?
Full screen now, yes, thank you.
Awesome. All right. It pays to have tech rehearsals. So
Yeah. The Pownalborough Courthouse, epicenter of Maine's colonial settlement. The early years, first encounters, 1620s to 1749. Historically, the Kennebec River has served as gateway to and from Canada, the lakes and waters of inland Maine, and the Penobscot River system. It has always served as a major path of migration and industry for native peoples. Due to an abundant fisheries and forest resources, Europeans moved into this area starting in 1607 with the Popham colony at the river's mouth. The Pilgrims at Cushnock or Augusta. In order to pay their debts from the 1620 trip, the Pilgrims sought and were granted a large tract of land centered on the Kennebec. In 1628, they built a trading post at Cushnock, primarily for the beaver pelt trade. Beaver hats were, of course, all the rage in England and Europe at that time. As a sidebar, there are plans now to rebuild Cushnock over the next few years at the old Fort Western property. More traders on the Kennebec. By the mid-1650s, the Clark and Lake Company, centered in Rouseck, purchased lands above and below the Pilgrims. They set up their own trading posts at Taconic, which is the junction of the Sebasticook and Kennebec rivers in Waterville-Winslow area, and also at Agries Point in Pittston, which is 6 miles upriver from the Pownalborough Courthouse. And this is where Benedict Arnold picked up his 220 bateau in 1775. This new competition strangled what was left of the beaver trade, they being mostly trapped out anyway, so the Pilgrims sold their local interest to a group of 4 Boston businessmen. This was known as the Kennebec Purchase and occurred in 1661. At that date, some 300 white settlers lived along the 40 miles between Cushnock and the river's mouth at Popham. King Philip's War, 1675-76, King William's War, 1688-1699, and Queen Anne's War, 1703 to 1713. After decades of peaceful relations, the native peoples and the European settlers came to blows. In 1676, all area settlers were driven off, their houses burned, and their cattle killed. It would not be until 1715 before white settlers resettled Merrymeeting Bay in the upper Tidewater Kennebec. The Pajevska proprietors. Starting in 1715, this group of Boston investors began to promote settlements at Brunswick and Topsham. Robert Temple and the Clark and Lake heirs brought in another 200 Scots-Irish in 1719-20 into Cork on the east shore of the Kennebec and Woolwich and Dresden. The proprietors started a defensible house or fort at Richmond in 1720 that eventually allowed and secured white settlement in this region. 1749 to 1760, a military frontier, the rise of the Kennebec proprietors. Rediscovery of the Kennebec purchase deed. Samuel Goodwin, heir to one of the four men who bought out the Pilgrims' interests, tracked the deed down 88 years later. He located other heirs. His partner in this effort was Robert Temple, previously at Cork. They bought and sold shares in a new corporation founded in 1749, which we call the Kennebec Proprietors. Seeing the successful settlement around Merrymeeting Bay, they decided it was now time to protect and develop their own interests in the Kennebec. James Bowden, proprietor and one of the proprietors, proposed to the Massachusetts General Court to settle these frontiers. He said, "The woods are stored with masts, yards, spars, and a variety of other timber suitable for the shipbuilder and other mechanics, and a great number of pitch pine trees, which are that source of pitch tar and turpentine. The rivers and adjacent seas abound with fish of some sorts, most sorts, particularly salmon, sturgeon, alewives, shad, mackerel, and beyond all, codfish. These are some of the natural advantages we have." Samuel Goodwin, surveyor and agent, was soon on the land representing the interests of the proprietors. Okay, next. Next. This is the earliest depiction of the courthouse, and it appears on a document produced by Samuel Goodwin. It's generally accurate, although there's great debate of whether that thingamajiggy over the front door was ever there or not. That was not able to be determined. Next, Ted. So what you see here up the top, middle, going down to the bottom right side is Route 128. And then you see the road coming into the courthouse, which is in the sort of the lower left corner. And just upriver or to the left of the courthouse is our neighbor's house, the Lamakans. And you also see above where the Pownalborough Courthouse is written, it says cemetery. That is the cemetery associated with the families that lived in the courthouse. Next one, Ed. Frankfurt is settled in March 1752, 46 families, mostly Huguenots or French Protestants, and a few Germans and a few Swiss were brought in and settled upon Dresden Neck between the Kennebec and Eastern rivers. A defensible house was erected on the proprietors' lands where the Pownalborough Courthouse now stands. It was surrounded by a 200 square foot palisade, had 2 corner blockhouses, and had a barracks building. This was really a sales tool to put on the map and say, look, we have a fort on our side of the river, because right across the river was Fort Richmond still standing. Next, Ed. Oh, no, leave this one for a second. So you notice this is the problem. These two maps were both made by Thomas Johnston in 1754. One shows the blockhouses top left, bottom right, the other top right, bottom left. And the bottom of the two images shows the 200 square foot. So that was the assumption going into doing all the archaeology. It turns out that was not the case. But if you rotate that lower picture 90 degrees, then you get really what was on the land. Next. So this is the final report of the archaeological work, which went on for 18 seasons. And it was wrapped up in 2001. All of the records, all of the artifacts are now at Old Fort Western, sitting beside, but not intermingled with, all of the Fort Richmond, Fort Halifax, and Fort Western. So it's a wonderful comparative collection, and Linda Novak up there would love to share it with you. Next. So this is the actual master plan of all of the work done archaeologically. In the top right, where the little squares are the thickest, that's where our neighbor's garden is. And that's where they were looking for a blockhouse. There is absolutely not one there. We can trace the two palisade lines joining, and there's no evidence of any blockhouse there. The bottom right corner of the square is where we believe that the smaller blockhouse was, and that's where the ammunition would have been kept away from everything else. You can see the courthouse itself, and if you look to the bottom left, you can see where the corner blockhouse was, and the palisade line ran right in front of the current courthouse and almost touched the courthouse's northwest corner. Yeah. Next. So this is my overlay, and this is rotated 90 degrees from the last thing. You can see the rivers at the top, the courthouse, and you can see where the main blockhouse was. It was the last year of the dig. After they're wrapping everything up, I talked to the two archaeologists and said, you know, I just found an 1890s report by Charles Allen that makes it clear that the blockhouse was under the Delmacans' house. So they went back and they pretty well confirmed that was most likely the case. So in 1754, Royal Governor William Shirley came up the New Meadows River and into the Kennebec at the urging of the Kennebec proprietors. Fearing an invasion by the French and native peoples from the north, Shirley agreed to have the province build and garrison a new upriver fort called Fort Halifax at Taconic. In return, the proprietors agreed to build a supply fort, Fort Western, at their own expense at the head of tide in Augusta. Frankfort's defensible house now became known as Fort Shirley. There was only one time there were ever soldiers actually stationed at Fort Shirley, and that was in 1756 from March until December. It was a ranging company commanded by Major Samuel Goodwin, and what they did was they went up and down the coastal area looking for Native Americans on the move. They also did a lot of hauling of supplies from Fort Western up to Fort Halifax. The conflict with the Native Americans soon eased. The exception was in June of 1758, when the Preble family was attacked in Days Ferry, Woolwich, with many carried to Canada. France was driven from Quebec and Montreal in 1759, and with these French interests gone, it was assumed that they would not be stirring up and teaming up with the native peoples, and anticipation of peace resulted in great changes in the Kennebec. Next, Ed. So these are two maps of the property. Again, the river is on the left, sort of running across from top right to bottom right is what's called the Common Road. That was one of the original rangeways. The yellow area is what belongs to the Pownalborough Courthouse, and now the property right below it, which says Waters, is also the Pownalborough Courthouse. Yeah, right in there. Next. And I should mention, in all this acreage, there's wonderful trail systems, and you can see that there's a lot of change in elevation and little stream beds, and there are bridges that you can go up and over, and there's even from the road on the east side of the River Road, there is a handicap trail that's accessible for wheelchair and so on. Next. 1760 to 1794, a civil landscape. Incorporation. Pownalborough, with the end of hostilities, it was time to get things moving. The Kennebec proprietors' grant extended 15 miles on each side of the river. This meant they could lay claim to the ice-free seaport of Wiscasset and that part of Sheepscot west of the river by that name. They did so and had what is today Wiscasset, Alna, Dresden, and Swan Island incorporated in February of 1760 as the town of Pownalborough. It was named in honor of then Royal Governor Thomas Pownal. Lincoln County. 4 months later, in June of 1760, Cumberland and Lincoln counties were set off from York County. All lands north and east of Lewiston on the Androscoggin accounting for about 90% of today's Maine, became Lincoln County. The county was named after the birthplace of Governor Pownal in England. Pownalborough was named the shire town to host the new county government. The proprietors, wanting to keep the focus of power and authority where it would benefit them most, in the middle of their holdings, offered to build a new courthouse at their own expense within the palisade of Fort Shirley. It was an offer too good to be refused. Power draws the powerful. Opportunity drew folks from near and far. Those coming from lower Massachusetts included Clerk of Courts and Registrar of Deeds, Jonathan Bowman, who was a nephew of proprietor Thomas Hancock and the first cousin to later Governor John Hancock. Chief Justice William Cushing of the Court of Common Pleas, you'll hear about more of him later. His brother, the sheriff, Charles Cushing, their brother, Roland Cushing, a lawyer, and Edmund Bridge, who served as town clerk and who was the one that recorded the Declaration of Independence into the town records. Next. This is an old picture from the Richmond Bee, and it's obviously inaccurate, but I thought it was pretty funny. Next. The Pownalborough Courthouse, land and buildings. The Pownalborough Courthouse is a structure. When erected in 1761, the courthouse was the tallest building north of the Strawberry Bank, which is now Portsmouth, New Hampshire. It was clearly a declaration that civilization, law and order had arrived, and that it was time to start buying and settling our lands. This 3.5-story central hallway, 5-bay, 44 by 45 foot double chimneyed Georgian, was designed by the Boston housewright and glazier and Kennebec proprietor Gershom Flagg. Flagg also, next Ed. Gershom Flagg. Flagg also oversaw the building of Fort Shirley, so the earlier palisaded fort on this land, Fort Western, and then later the nearby Bowman House, which is now open to the public through Historic New England. His nephew, James Flagg, oversaw the courthouse construction. Simple, graceful, symmetrical, a statement. What's interesting is that when we have school kids in there, we have them look up in the parlor, and there, sure enough, James Flagg carved the initials on his building. He was so proud of his work. Other changes. In preparation for erection of the courthouse, the proprietors tore down the palisade, the gates, and part of the barracks. They converted the east end of the barracks into the jailer's house for Samuel Goodwin Jr. and converted the corner blockhouse that stood where the neighbor's steps stand today into a jail by adding on to it. There was also a pillory, which is a thing you put your head and hands through when standing up, the stocks that you put your feet through, and the whipping post that you didn't want to be attached to at all, were erected. Labor a gibbet was also erected for public hangings. Next, Ed. These next ones are a series of historic American building survey drawings done during the Works Progress Administration, and these were done in 1936. Next. So that's the upriver view, and you see there's a door there that was not original to the building, but later when this served as, well, the tavern, but also the post office, that was the door that the public used. Next. This is sort of a feeling for the building. You can see it has a full basement for the most part. There are 3 full stories and an attic. It's again a central hallway, so there are in effect 2 rooms on the right of the central hallway and 2 on the left on the first and third floors. And the second floor, there's the courtroom runs the whole river side of the building, so all 45 feet. Next, Ed. That's the basement. Next. This shows the center hallway, and on the left is the kitchen and parlor back-to-backs, and on the other one is the tavern, it says east room, and then the north room. In these chimney masses are so huge, there are 14 separate flues, 7 in each chimney, that exit the top. 1 for each of the 2 fireplaces on that floor times 3, plus the bake oven in both sides. We had the top of the chimney repaired a few years ago, and interestingly, because of all the cross bracing between the flues, it was still original brick, every one of them. It never had to be replaced. Next. So you can see here, the courtroom runs the whole riverside, the top of the picture here. Next. That's the roof framing. If you had noticed the way the roof lines run, they run from the center down to the corners rather than having a common eave or ridge. Next. So this is the letter where Gershom Flagg, you see his wonderful signature at the bottom, where he agrees to go to Pownalborough with enough men to frame and finish the house that he had begun last fall. So that would have been 1760, they started it, agreeable to the plan and direction. But he says, I will expect to be paid the Boston rules of work. Interestingly, when they submitted the bill for the building, the proprietors insisted on paying the Maine rules of work, which are about 5 or 10% cheaper per 100, you know. So they actually didn't finally settle with the Flaggs until 1769. Next. We do have a full copy for an invoice for everything that was put into the building. So we can tell you exactly which brickyards the bricks came from and so on. It's really quite a document, and there is a copy on display at the courthouse. Next. So this is part of the cross and dragon system. This is what holds the whole building together. The building is 45 feet end to end and 44 feet river to road. And in that 44 feet span, on every floor, there are no internal supports, no internal support posts. So the whole weight of the building is cast to the outside skin, and that's why it's still as straight and true today as it ever could be. These cross, next one, Ed. So this is the cross and dragon beam. There are 4 of these setups, each of the 4 corners of the 3rd floor and under the attic. So you can see that it locks in the 2 walls and ties the walls to the corner. But what you don't see is the 5-sided beam that comes down from the ridge of the roof also locks in there. So the walls inside could literally be removed, other than one that supports the stairway, and the building would still stand. Patterns on the land. Just as all paths once led to the trading post at Cushnock, now all paths of travel networked at the Pownalborough Courthouse. The only cross-river ferry within 15 miles left from the riverbank out front. Samuel Goodwin Jr. was the ferryman. The original dirt wagon road up the east side of the Kennebec once ran right through the palisade, in one set of gates and out the other. As a licensed tavern, the courthouse would have needed barns to shelter and feed horses, with 14, and also assumably outhouses and refuse deposits. We have not found any evidence of any of those. There would also have been a woodshed, and later, what's now the L was built in 1839 as a woodshed. Next, Ed. So this is the tavern room. It looks a little different today. These are older pictures. We have a wonderful collections committee that has really upgraded the display of the things in our collection. So, but this will give you an idea. Where that window is where that door had been that went into the tavern and the post office. Starting in September 1761, the courts were held twice a year, in June and September, with each session lasting a week to 10 days. At those times, there were likely hundreds of people on the grounds, packed cheek to jowl, sleeping in canvas tents. Other times would find a smaller gathering with the Goodwin family, a few travelers seeking shelter, food, and drink, and a few townspeople enjoying the community of the tavern. There were also church services, town meetings, and other gatherings held in this building at that time, especially anything that required a large room and heat in cold weather. Next, Ed. Next, Ed. So this is, the building is full of graffiti. There's probably no public building that has more public graffiti in it than this building. A lot of it's chalk, but in this case, in the tavern room wall, there is carved the sloop Polly. And if you go to the next slide, Ed. And this was involved with one of the first naval battles of the Revolution off of Machias, when goods were brought in to sell for profit rather than to meet the immediate need of the people there. And the locals went out and captured the Margaretta, which was a gunship, and 3 local sloops, the Polly being one of them. Next, Ed. So this was from that carving. This is a sketch that was done, and the maritime historians have said, yes, that's exactly what the Polly would have looked like. What had happened is they marched the prisoners to Pownalborough to lock them up in the jail before they were sent on to Charlestown or Boston. And it's thought that perhaps one of the guards made the carving. And we assume it was a guard because it's a pretty strong hand. It wasn't somebody who'd been in the tavern drinking very much. Next, Ed. So now county government. County government had register of deeds and probate, which provided orderly transfer of real and personal property. The courts regulated public behavior by creating order and arbitrating community standards. They enforced the needs of government and those in control, including the collection of duties, excises, and fees. The courts at Pownalborough operated under the authority of King George II, King George III, the people, and then the province of Massachusetts Bay, and finally the Commonwealth of Massachusetts in America. Male voters elected representatives to the Great and General Court, which is the legislature, and this court appointed the justices, the registered clerks, the attorney generals, and the sheriffs. Others, such as jurors, the collectors of excise, and the county treasurer, deputy sheriff, and the jailer were elected by the county. The courts. Every community had a justice of the peace responsible for keeping local order. He was usually the richest, most powerful man available, often the employer of men and the head of the militia. With his own pillory and stocks, he ruled what he needed to rule on. Twice a year, all of these justices of the peace that wanted to came together from throughout the county and would sit as the court of general sessions of the peace. This was primarily an administrative body overseeing county finances, laying out roads, licensing ferries, taverns, and even chocolatiers back then. They also had jurisdiction over petty criminal matters and ruled on the moral offenses of drunkenness, cursing, skipping worship, fornication, bastardy, etc. This is primarily a men's club, to be honest. Women were allowed in the courtroom. Only one woman that we know of ever gave testimony, and that was Martha Ballard, and she gave it in writing. But at every one of these lower court sessions, they would usually have 2 or 3 young women come in, have to admit to having sex outside of marriage, and they would be fined. They'd be given court costs, and if they didn't want to pay the fine, then they got so many stripes on the naked back at the whipping post. To our knowledge, no one ever actually opted for that. The Court of Common Pleas. From the pool of all these justices of the peace, oh, and by the way, one court case, there are 18 of these justices of the peace lined up against the wall deciding where the new road was going to go and so on. From the pool of justices of the peace, a chief justice and 3 associate justices were appointed by the Court of Common Pleas, were appointed to the Court of Common Pleas. The primary role of this court was dispute resolution. Much of their time was spent dealing with cases of trespass or debt and with cases involving titles to land. They had general common law civil jurisdiction. Most serious cases of felony were heard by the Supreme Court of Judicature, which was then held in Falmouth or Portland, even for cases in Lincoln County. Then in 1786, the renamed Supreme Judicial Court did meet at the Pownalborough Courthouse for 7 of the 8 years before the courts were moved to Wiscasset proper. In all, there were multiple murder trials held here, and at least 3 of them were found guilty and hanged on site. The jail and the jail yard. The jail was used to house debtors and an occasional felon awaiting the Supreme Judicial Court. Most defendants simply posted a bond and waited at home until the court sat next. Oh, by the way, you were never sentenced to jail unless you were a debtor or you were waiting execution. One was never sentenced to jail back then. The guilty paid a fine and the cost of court and were usually sentenced to time in the pillory of the stocks or lashing at the whipping post. Public humiliation set an example for others. Later, an overbuilt gibbet was erected as a prominent spot so that all could witness the hanging, especially those out on the river on boats. The character of the law. I'm going to read you from a Gershom flag short letter here. 12 September 1761. I have the pleasure to tell you that on the 9th instant, I had the house well covered and shingled on the top and covered over the lower floor with our rough boards, put up seats and tables and etc. proper to receive the court, which entered the same in procession, with Mr. Thing at ye head, having prepared him a white wand for that purpose. After the court was opened, the Reverend Mr. Rice, gentleman from Sutton, prayed with the court very agreeably, and all was performed very much to the liking of all the spectators, which was many. They finished their court last night, and this day make up judgments, and are to return home. The chief judge with the rest of the gentry drank the company a health and wished all well. I have no time to add, but am with esteem your assured friend and humble servant, Gershom Flag. The white wand you'll see in a minute was actually the symbol of authority of the sheriff, and it way predates the use of a gavel or anything in a courtroom. Okay. So the sheriff with his white wand, his deputies, the justices in robe and powdered wig, and any lawyers present formed up into a grand procession led by a drummer boy. They marched in line onto the grounds and into the building. The decisions they made were based on a body of law and regulation that came from the great and general court and what was known as common law. The justices relied on collective memory bolstered by mock trials staged at night, for there were no books of case law to reference. Okay, and next, this I thought was funny. Talk about plan ahead. If you notice the top, this was a pre-printed form or a writ, and it had said George II. And of course, he died after the courts were created, but before the first session was held. So they all had to be crossed out and they had to write in George III. Next. So this is the courtroom today, pretty much as it stands. You notice the chairs in the front would be the judges. They're on a raised platform. They were trying to elevate themselves in society a little bit. Lawyers already had a bad name back then, some of them. Next. And here you see by the door on the left, the open door on the hallway, to our left of that is the box that whoever was standing trial would stand in. And then the white one would be where the witnesses would give testimony. There may or may not have been a railing in front of the judge's area, like you would have in some of the old meeting houses in the churches, but there's no evidence of that we could find yet today. Next. So there's one of those white wands. They were 6 feet, white pine, and painted white. Cases and characters. One case we often recount is when a young John Adams came to Pownalborough to defend a longtime landowner against new claims for payment made by the Kennebec proprietors. Adams won his case, and that's because of a jury trial. So the Kennebec proprietors knew that they would never win a case in their own courtroom, so they had John Adams represent them in Falmouth, and all of their cases were tried there, and he became a fairly rich man off of them. The other is when George North of Augusta, who was one of the 4 sitting justices of that middle court, was accused of raping the minister's wife. That's when the midwife Ballard gave her testimony, and Judge North was found not guilty. All it took was one guy to stand up and say, I slept with her too. The minister's wife did in fact give birth 9 months and 20 minutes after the alleged incident, according to Martha Ballard. William Cushing, I mentioned earlier, he was attorney to the Kennebec proprietors and the first Chief Justice of the Lincoln County Court of General Sessions of the Peace. He later went on and became Chief Justice of the Massachusetts Supreme Court of Judicature, where in 1783 he ruled slavery to be illegal in Massachusetts, the first time ever slavery was outlawed in the colonies. President George Washington appointed Cushing to the United States Supreme Court in 1789. He was offered and confirmed as that court's first Chief Justice, but turned down the position due to old age. And then we got John Marshall instead. Cushing continued to serve as an Associate Justice for 18 years until his death in 1807. Pownalborough Courthouse in the American Revolution. I've talked about the Margaretta and Sloop Polly. Benedict Arnold was here in 1775. We found 3 letters from Samuel Goodwin to George Washington requesting payment for the maps. And in one of them, he says, I delivered the large one at my house, which would have been the courthouse. Sam Goodwin Jr. Attacked his brother-in-law, who was a British captain and had to come to court himself here. Reverend Jacob Bailey refused to read the Declaration of Independence, and he had to flee. And all these are Revolutionary War stories tied to the courthouse. One of the funniest things, I think, is that I travel on Sunday when the courts had to open Tuesday morning at 10 o'clock, period, when it was posted. So the justices left Portland or Falmouth late, and they ended up having to travel on a Sunday. And in Freeport, the citizens made a citizen's arrest of the Attorney General and 2 of the justices of the Supreme Court for unnecessary travel on Sunday. Needless to say, they found a way to get out of it. I should also say that the Maine Supreme Judicial Court has met twice in the courtroom, once in 2004 and once in 2011. In terms of court cases, as I say, there have been quite a few. One of real interest was the murder trial of Samuel Hadlock of Mount Desert Island. He was presented for murdering Eliab Gott. There was some local debate of whether if he was truly guilty, but he was convicted. He escaped, avoided recapture until 2 years later when he killed another person. So it was decided that he would be hanged. They put him up there. They hanged him once. The rope broke. They had to make him climb up again, and they succeeded the second time. There was also Edmund Fortis of Vassalboro, a Black man who was convicted of rape and murder in the death of Pamela Tilton by strangulation. He pleaded guilty and was executed. And I know the courthouse crew is doing a lot of research and work right now on Black slaves and so on in this area. So in 1794, Dresden split off from Pownalborough. The courts moved to what's now Wiscasset. And from 1794 till 1954, the courthouse served as a private home to the Goodwin, to the Johnson, to the Twycross, the Prescott, and the Canby family, who were all related. It was the post office from 1807 to 1855. It was a dancing school for a time. Finally, in 1813, the Kennebec proprietors gave clear title to the Goodwins. Next, Ed. This just shows, you probably can't see it well, but on the edge of the beam, all of the beams have this wonderful chamfered edge, which would have been an extra cost. And someone pointed out to me that if you don't do that, you get little tiny splinters. And if you have a fire runs quickly. So that may be the reason for that, despite the cost. Next. This is the judge's room. They did not go down into the tavern. They stayed upstairs. They had their meals brought up, the drink brought up. They would hold mock trials at night to sort of remember how cases were handled. John Adams, when he was there as a young lawyer, he would have been the one on trial, and he would have been the one that had to go down and bring up the drinks. Next. That's an example of a stock. You see the guy isn't very comfortable. Next. There's a wonderful collection of old housewright tools there. When you bring kids in, they say, well, where are the power packs? Where are the extension cords? Where is the generator? How'd they build a building? And this is how. Next. There are stories of artists at the building. The first one was Henry Cheever Pratt, who was a fairly well-known Boston portrait painter. I think there are 9 Pratt paintings in the building, and they're really worth seeing, and mostly of family members. Next. He was up there one time and needed a large canvas to paint the 2 Hooper kids, girl on the left, boy on the right, even though he's got a dress on. Obviously, he wasn't potty trained yet. But what's interesting is that he didn't have a big enough canvas. So if you look at the lower picture, you can see it's actually an old woven coverlet, probably made at the courthouse, that was converted into a canvas. Next. One of Henry Cheever Pratt's very good friends was Thomas Cole, who started the Hudson School of Landscape. In 1844, it came up to the Pownalborough Courthouse, and this is one of the two Thomas Cole sketches that have been found so far. He was also a published poet, and he wrote a poem sitting on the banks of the Kennebec out front of the building. Next. This is another version. I think this is Lulu Canby or maybe her father, but there have been a series of artists that have depicted the buildings that they were brought up in. Next. So today, from 1954 till today, the museum has been run as a museum by Lincoln County. Lincoln County.
This element, atomic number 30, is used in sunscreens to provide protection from UV rays. Brad, no.
Hey, Robin, can you mute yourself? There we go.
So from 54 till today, the Lincoln County Historical Association has managed the building and grounds as a museum. There's a lot of info on foodways, on the tavern culture, on samplers. There's the largest collection of samplers made by a single set of relatives, I think, anywhere in the world on display. A lot on textiles. We recently found a cookbook in the records that is one of, I think, 9 known to exist, and it has an actual original Paul Revere lithograph engraving in it. We also, there are concerts, plays, filmings, school groups, et cetera, including weddings. The Pownalborough Courthouse collection itself, which is all the papers that came out of the building, are at Maine Historical. It's about 45 shelf feet of documents covering everything you would ever want to know, from recipes to ship's papers to visits to Hawaii and so on. I will say that this year, why don't you go next slide, Ed? Ed?
Yeah, that may be it. Oh, no, there we go. Sorry.
Next. So this year on Memorial Day, leaving the flagpole right at 11 o'clock, we will celebrate the 69th consecutive Memorial Day service. And right after that, the building opens for the season and you're welcome in at no charge. Next. The gentleman on the left is the late Reverend Bruce Alexander. Next. Next. So I guess I got a couple minutes. One thing I'd like to end with is the ghost stories. To our knowledge, I'm aware of 4 different ghosts that have appeared through time. The first one, Elizabeth Goodwin, Samuel Goodwin's wife, was coming up the road on the east side of the river, and just below the courthouse, where a wet stream crossed the road, as she was pulling up her skirts to walk through it, this woman on a horse came raging by her, basically knocked her sideways. And then when Elizabeth turned to look, there was no one there. And she recorded that, and Reverend Jacob Bailey talks about that. The other was that for many years in that L on the left, which was the woodshed and then the kitchen, it so happens that the Palisade line went right through the sleeping quarters to the left end of this L as we look at it. And 3 different sets of docents who were living in the apartment in the summertime witnessed a militia guard with musket walk right where the Palisade line would have been. And they did not discuss this among themselves. It's all 3 separate reports. And the other is that there's a woman that is usually on the 2nd floor who's often come out when little children are around. Peter Morrissey is the only one that I know of who's had a recent encounter with her. And Pete's often around and he can tell you about it, but it spooked him. So when he comes in the door now, he immediately announces himself, who he is. And the other was that there was an older fellow that used to sit outside the tavern door, so right inside the front door of the building here, sitting on the stairs smoking a pipe. I know someone who encountered him. It's the wife of a Dresden Select member. One day in February, in the middle of the morning, I was called in to check the alarm system. And this was in February, and right outside the tavern door, there was the sweetest smell of something that had been smoked. So I don't know if I was given a message too, but next, Ed. And that is the end. I'd be happy to take any questions if there are any. You're welcome to contact me at robinshistorical@gmail.com.
Well, thank you, Jay. That was a lot of information. So I think that it's great that, you know, we have recorded it and it'll be on the website in a few days. And so people may want to go back and listen to it slowly and kind of try and absorb, you know, stuff that they might have missed tonight. I don't see any questions in the chat, but if people want to pipe in, please do. We have a couple of minutes
I
here.
will say that, especially in the court things, I have probably 1.5 banker's boxes of original research into all the records I could find, and I'm more than willing to share that with anybody who has an interest in particular individuals or cases or whatever.
Well, last call for questions. Going.
Can I throw one more thing in then?
Oh, go ahead.
So in 1880, Samuel Goodwin was the last resident owner, if you will. And in the 1880 farm schedule, he had 75 acres tilled, 75 acres of meadows and pastures, 10 acres of woodland and forest, and 5 acres of other improved, including old fields not in use. The value of the farm was $3,000, the implements and machinery $280, the livestock $235. Estimated value of all farm products $533. 20 acres of mown, 15 tons of hay harvested, 2 horses, 2 oxen, 5 milk cows, 3 other cattle, 2 calves dropped, 700 pounds of butter, 1 swine, 30 poultry, 260 dozen eggs provided, 1 acre of barley yielding 12 bushels, 1 acre of Indian corn yielding 50 bushels, a half an acre of oats yielding 15 bushels, 1 acre of wheat yielding 16 bushels, 3 bushels of dry beans, 1.5 acres of potatoes yielding 150 bushels, 1 acre of apples with 50 bearing trees giving 60 bushels, valued at $25, and 15 cord of wood at a value of $45. So it really was a truly large working farm at one time too, and you don't really get the feel of that now because it's all grown back up into woods.
Okay, I'm not sure you you touched on this, but do you want to say a few words about who has cared for the courthouse since people stopped living in it and how that
Well,
works?
the Lincoln County, originally Lincoln County Cultural and Historical, now the Lincoln County Historical Association, because they sold off the art museum, has been taking care of it. And generally the way it's been done is in the summer, once enough fixing up inside was done that it could be open to the public, they would usually have a docent live in the L and mow the lawn and greet people as they came in. More recently, it's been a more set schedule with trained docents. The hours, I know they've changed recently and I'm not sure, but they would be on the Facebook page for Lincoln County Historical and on the sign out front. But the docents take you through and give you what you want to know, or if there's a particular topic you like, they'll deal with that. Ranger Dave Probert, who's with us here, is the one that takes care of really overseeing the buildings and the trails. And Chuck Vaughn, whose father was related to the family here. And Dave co-hosts the stewardship committee. So there's a group of, I'm going to say 10, 12 people who meet monthly to talk just about the needs of that building. And then they report to the motherboard, who looks after this building as well as the Chapman Hall House in Damascotta and the old jail and jailer's house in Wiscasset. So it's very well managed because the decisions about what needs to be done are made locally. The policy and the big money issues are solved at the higher level. And it seems to be working great. Thank you, Dave.
And so anyone who wants to be a docent or get involved, they contact Lincoln County Historical.
Right. Shannon Gilmore is the executive director, and she can be reached at the phone number again on the website.
Great. Well, thank you, Jay, very much. And thank you all for coming. And again, thanks to Lisa Robbins and Martin. And I hope check our website in a couple of days. And hopefully we'll have this up by then, and it'll be there to refer people to. And hopefully some of you can join us tomorrow night and support all those great third and fourth graders who worked really hard on their project. So, and keep your eyes open and ears peeled for see if we get a summer series going again this summer. We'll have some outdoor things. So thank you all. And we'll close.
Thank you.